Hello and welcome. We are discussing a really interesting piece of political philosophy today, and that is Locke and the theory of property that he offers us in his second treatise of government. So, here's the plan. First, I want to take a brief moment to acknowledge that in the cycle of videos this is coming in the course that it's a part of, we're moving on to a new unit. So our first question was roughly something like this. What justifies the existence and power of the state? And that was our first question. Our new question is about the nature of property. What is property? What are property rights? And also, how should we think philosophically about inequality? In other words, we might ask the question, what sorts of inequality are incompatible with a just state, and what sorts of inequality might be compatible with a just state? And one theorist that we need to look at in order to understand this question of a just state is Locke. Because Locke gives us a theory of natural rights, that is, all human beings, just in virtue of human beings, have certain rights independent of the social contract. And from this theory of rights, we also get a theory of property, a theory that will ultimately tell us how it is that some of us can have unequal shares in certain particular goods. I don't know, like this lamp behind me is my lamp, right? And we might say that insofar as it's my lamp and not yours, I have an unequal amount of access to it compared to everybody else in the world, right? So this idea of property rights is going to be closely connected with and therefore essential to be studied in these discussions of how much equality and what sorts of equality we're looking for in a just society. So on that topic, here are some questions that we might consider once we start thinking about property and inequality and also things like justice. We might sort of ask the question, how do we make philosophical sense of the concept of property? I'm thinking of it in this way. We might think that for a lot of things, like my lamp, let's say, we can talk about some of its properties in a purely scientific, empirical approach. So we could talk about the lamp having a certain weight, or a certain color, or a certain shape, right? These are properties inherent to the lamp. But what about the lamp makes it such that it is my property, right? We might think that's not something that you can see on a scale, or even on a color meter, or even in a photograph. And we might start to ask the question of, well, is property and the concept of property something that we just made up? Would we want to think of a property right as equivalent to the way that we talk about fairies? Or maybe it's like fictional characters, right? Maybe facts about property are kind of like facts about Sherlock Holmes, right? So there are a bunch of philosophical questions that arise in the context of the concept of property. We can then ask, well, if some people have property rights to some things and others don't, how can we determine what sorts of distributions of property within society are acceptable from the point of view of justice? Eventually, we'll see differing answers to this very question. And when we start to ask questions about this kind of justice, justice about who deserves access to which goods, this is a large part of political philosophy when we start having discussions about what is sometimes called distributive justice. So the questions about who deserves which benefits and burdens, we're asking how to distribute the benefits and burdens within society. And, we might start asking in a very contemporary way, like what sorts of goods might we have to redistribute? Or does justice require us to leave everybody to themselves? These are hard questions, and they're ones that we're going to be examining. So this is why we're going to start with Locke, because he develops an important and influential theory of property. Just so you know, a couple of things about Locke. He was around mainly in the 17th century, a little bit into the 18th, was a Brit, and he developed important theories of how we gain knowledge from an empirical standpoint. And he also had an interesting theory of personal identity. What is it for you to be you? Locke gave us the answer. Well, it's for you to have memory of your past, in a nutshell. If you want to learn more about Locke's theory of knowledge or his theory of personal identity, I recommend you check out my course PHI 342, Early Modern Philosophy. But besides being an important epistemologist and metaphysician, Locke is also a significant political philosopher. So the book that we're looking at a piece from is Second Treatise of Government. He's also well known for the letter concerning toleration. But Locke was not just found to be a good philosopher, but his ideas had a large influence on the real world. Right? So Locke tells us that we have natural rights to life, liberty, and property. Well, interestingly, the founders of the United States of America in the Declaration of Independence, in their appeal to the right of all, the natural, God-given, inalienable right of all, they talk about life, liberty, they talk about the pursuit of happiness instead of property, but it's well documented that the founders were reading Locke and were heavily influenced by Locke. Another interesting thing, and especially interesting for me and my students and everybody else who lives here in North Carolina, it's very interesting to know that Locke was working with a particular lord in Britain in the 1660s. And Lord Shaftesbury, or a guy named Sir Anthony Ashley Cooper, was the person who founded the Carolina colony before the Declaration of Independence, right? And one thing that's notable to observe and to mark in history is that Locke was working as a co-author, right? So we could think of Locke as a ghostwriter, something of a secretarial role, but he was doing work in setting up colonies in the Americas and ended up having a large influence on the actual nature of early Carolinian law. Now, one thing that's notable and also shameful is that Locke did, through the drafting of this Constitution, legally codify slavery in the Carolinas. Although we will note that his Second Treatise of Government was not written with somebody else's goals in mind. When he wrote for himself, he was quite clear that he was strongly against any slavery among people, that his idea of natural rights was firmly against it. And in a certain way, we can see that maybe Locke displayed a certain amount of philosophical growth between his work on the Constitution of the Carolinas and the essay and the Second Treatise of Government, most importantly. So let's talk about Locke's theory of natural rights. He tells us that natural rights, liberty, these considerations are of supreme moral importance. So if we want to think about whether people are getting what they truly deserve from the moral point of view, we'd want to think about a person's right to life, liberty, and for Locke, property. Now, when he says that liberty is of central importance, we might think of Locke as saying something kind of similar to Hobbes in the way that he talks about liberty, where liberty is just to be left alone. And Locke is clear about this. He calls out another philosopher, Filmer, and Locke says he doesn't think that freedom is a matter of just having no laws. Instead, he's going to say that freedom is about being able to do as you please, to follow your own will, but in turn, you also need to focus on not being subject to the arbitrary and tyrannical rule of others. And in this way, we might think of what Locke is doing as he's emphasizing not just negative liberty, but he's also focused on what Rousseau would have called civil rights, or what Anderson would go on to call something like republican freedom, to not be subject to the arbitrary will of another. And an important difference that we'll also see with Hobbes for Locke is that Locke thinks that everybody has a natural right to life, liberty, and property, even in the state of nature, right? So the idea is there is something that we could call an injustice and even a rights violation in a situation where there are no laws and there is no government. Now, think back to Hobbes, right? When Hobbes was thinking about the state of nature, he thought it was this terrible hellscape because each individual has the right to do all things and that nothing is just and nothing is unjust. Well, Locke is going to give us an alternative theory where he's going to say, even if there is no law, even if there are no coercive forces, it's still wrong for you to take away my liberty or to ruin my life or to end my life, right? So your right to freedom and the possibility of injustice extends beyond just the social contract for Locke, right? He's going to say that you have a natural right to your God-given liberties and your life. He is so committed to this idea of natural liberties that he says that your right to freedom from absolute arbitrary power, he says you can't give up that right even if you try. Now, it is true that for many of your rights, you can voluntarily waive your right. So, for instance, you have a right to privacy, but at the same time, you are totally free to blab to as many people as you choose about all the personal details of your life, right? And you could post as much as you possibly can on the internet. That's your prerogative, right? But Locke says that when it comes to these fundamental rights of life, liberty, and property, those are rights that are what we call inalienable. When we talk about a right being alienable, we're talking about a right that can be given up or lost or voluntarily ceded, like that right to privacy. But Locke is going to tell us that your right to freedom is so absolute that you could not, for instance, sell yourself into slavery, right? So to sell yourself into slavery would be to have nothing of these supremely morally important goods. And Locke is going to say that because these are such valuable goods, it would be wrong to sell yourself into slavery, and no attempt to sell yourself into slavery would ever be a truly valid contract. It's a violation of natural rights, Locke thinks. He will say that you can forfeit your right to life if you commit a serious enough crime, but that's the one apparent exception for Locke here. So here are a couple of starting thoughts that's going to get us to Locke's theory of property rights. And he says that part of his argument is going to be conceptual and based on observation. He will also point out that his argument has theological backing. So, for instance, if we look at this passage from the book of Genesis, I've got the R. Crumb graphic novel illustration. We've got Adam and Eve being cast out of the Garden of Eden here. And we see that, look, God sends you out of the Garden of Eden and says that you need to till the ground from which you've been taken. So God is leaving you with the earth and is basically telling you, you need to go out and toil and work to survive. And as a matter of fact, we realize this individually. Even if you don't believe in God, you're going to realize that it takes effort and maybe some ingenuity to acquire all the resources you need to survive. But here's the first line of thought. Locke is going to tell us that God gave the world to mankind in common. Right? So at the start of society, we had a whole bunch of human beings around, moving about the earth, trying to survive. And in this original situation, we have a bunch of uncultivated resources available for people to acquire, cultivate, and use for their own survival. Right? And not only is there a world full of resources, but you have a natural right to self-preservation. And here Locke is going to tell us that every man, or I guess he should say every individual or person, has property in his own person. So at this point, we might say, like, how is it that you can acquire certain goods? Well, maybe the first thing that we need to know is that property, this right to have sole control over something, starts with a natural right that you have in yourself. So the idea is you have a right to protect your own life, and your body inherently belongs to you, to yourself. Remember, you can't sell yourself into slavery. Your body and your person belongs to you. And if you accept that you own yourself, Locke is also going to suggest that you also own your labor. So the thought would be, if you have true ownership over your body, you also have control over what you do with your body. And so your labor, by extension, is another part of you. So we've got this unowned open range of resources that is given to all of us in common. That means nobody in particular owns uncultivated land, but you do own your person and you do own your labor. Now, this is going to get us to property in things that are not just ourselves. So because your body and your labor belong to you, Locke is then going to tell us this. You can make something your property by mixing your labor, which already belongs to you, with resources from this thing that we call the state of nature, or the commons. This is this, realm of resources that creates, or this realm of resources that nobody owns, but that you can draw from in the process of trying to protect and preserve yourself. And Locke says that it's only in this mixture of your labor with unowned goods from the commons that could give us an adequate explanation of how something unowned becomes something that is owned. Right? He's going to say, it's not like the eating of a bag full of nuts that's going to make them your property. He's going to say that, and it's also not the growing or the seeing of them. It's going to be the cultivation of them. So it's that labor where you are using your efforts on unowned resources. He says that in that moment, your labor gets mixed up into these material goods. And that's the only plausible source of property rights that Locke can imagine. Here's how he puts it. So he says, "He that is nourished by the acorns he picked up under an oak, he has certainly appropriated them to himself." This word appropriation just means taking something from the commons and turning it into your own property. Nobody can deny that the nourishment is his. I then ask, when did the acorns become yours? When you digested them? He thinks that that's too late. When he ate them, also too late. When he boiled, too late. Or when he brought them home? No. Or when he picked them up. And Locke says that it's plain that the first gathering of these acorns from the commons, if that can't make the acorn yours, then nothing else could possibly make them yours. So he seems to say that the only plausible candidate for how unowned things become owned things is through this process of laboring on goods from the commons. So this gives us Locke's approach to saying, here's how things that weren't anybody's property become your property. They have your labor mixed up in them. Now, Locke does give us a couple of constraints. These are sometimes called the Lockean provisos. And we can think of these as limits on original property appropriation. So taking things out of the state of nature and turning them into property. First, for you to attain property rights, there need to be enough goods in the state of nature for everybody. Another way of putting this is that when I appropriate some good from the state of nature, other people in the state of nature aren't made any worse off. So we could imagine, for instance, you appropriating some water from a flowing river. Well, the thought is you aren't harming anybody else if you take a large pitcher and scoop up some water in that pitcher and then drink it. Because the point that Locke has is that when you do this and appropriate that water, there's still enough water flowing through the stream such that everybody can still do just as you did. They're not made any worse off. Now this raises questions. If you do some research, for instance, on how little water is flowing through the Colorado River in the American Southwest right now, you'll realize that, in fact, when people take a claim of that supply of water, it actually will eventually become harmful to others. And in that way, we might say that you don't have full entitlement to appropriate in those cases. So that's going to be one limit that Locke puts on his theory of appropriating unowned things and turning them into your property. He's also going to say that you can't acquire more property than you can, as he says, make use of to any advantage of life. And part of how we might think about this is that we could think of wasting natural resources. Remember, God gave us this land to till and use to survive. But let's say you went out and you started harvesting acorns. Again, we'll stick with the acorn example. And you know that to get through the winter, you will need exactly 150 pounds of acorns. If you were to harvest more than that, they would rot before you can eat them. Right? Now, Locke would say, whereas you can rightfully appropriate 150 pounds of acorns, you could not rightly appropriate 200 or 500 pounds of acorns, because that would be an insult to the gift of God in giving things to the commons, and moreover, it would be better for you to just take what you need and leave the rest in common for others to appropriate as they need. Now, one thing that Locke is mindful of, and this is where he starts to also acknowledge the fact that there are certain social contracts and conventions that are working alongside our natural rights. He's going to point out that oftentimes, if you were the sort of industrious person who maybe decided to, appropriate 500 pounds of acorns, even though you only need 150 pounds for yourself, one thing that could be done is you could then trade your surplus 350 pounds for little pieces of gold that we can then use to trade for other resources and goods further down the road. With that money, you might end up buying harmless pleasures. The idea that as long as you are making use and you're making yourself better off with the resources that you've acquired, one way to do that is acquire too much, sell what you can't use, and then benefit yourself through the expenditure of money. And in this way, even though we have this risk of what Locke would call spoilage, like an appropriated good can spoil if you take too much of it, well, the invention of money, we could say, is attenuating this, because in order to avoid spoiling goods, you could just trade them and get money. One of the good things about money is that it never quite goes bad, right? Money doesn't rot, and this is part of why we use things like gold as legal tender, right? Because it's stable. Now, there is the sense in which money can go bad through inflation. So money spent today is more powerful and more effective than if you just leave it in a shoebox under your bed for 20 years. The money, in a certain sense, will be worth less. But it's not like it completely spoils. Like if you, instead of keeping money under your mattress, you were keeping, venison, right? Meat would go bad quickly. Money doesn't go bad in that way. Now, this gives us the rough outlines of Locke's theory of property. But I think it opens up some really interesting questions, right? Like, what are we to do if there isn't enough uncultivated land or resource in the commons? One thing that we'll notice in Locke's second treatise of government is that he frequently remarks that America is this large, vast, uncultivated space full of resources. Right? To some extent, I think that Locke was underrating the extent to which that land was being used to good effect by indigenous people. But we would also realize that as we move into the 21st century here in America, we realize that resources are not so plentiful. Just as I mentioned in that case of the water running out in the Colorado River, not everybody in that region of the U.S. can use that water source to provide their drinking water and water their lawns and carry out agricultural functions, right? So then we might ask the question of, well, what are the limitations on our appropriation once there isn't enough in the commons? And again, this idea of anti-spoilage, that you need to only appropriate if it's going to do some good for you. We might notice that the more goods you have, the less good more money is going to do you, right? Like your quality of life won't go up that much when you go from having $2 million to $3 million in your bank account. Although going from $0 to $1 million is a much bigger difference. This is related to what economists call diminishing marginal utility. Now, Locke might say that, look, having $2 million, you're still going to have more advantages that you can make use of. And in this way, maybe you can still always be acquiring money. But we might also notice that in the background, if Locke is concerned about whether or not you can get genuine goods out of appropriation, some might make the argument that this actually limits the amount of property that a person can justly acquire. Some people, getting very interested in this idea that property is this natural phenomenon that occurs when a person who owns their own body and labor mixes it with unowned things. Well, there is a difficult question of what the act of appropriation actually comes to. So for instance, what if you come upon an empty island with no other persons on it? Could you just stick a flag into the eastern corner of that island and own the entire island from edge to edge to edge? Well, maybe. I guess we might have to think about the extent to which we can think of our labor as diffused throughout a large thing. I don't think that Locke necessarily has to buy into this idea that any little bit of effect that you might have on something counts as mixing your labor with it. Because a big part of how Locke defends his theory in the end is that he points out that the value of land for providing us with certain goods, he says, is like 9/10 or more a function of the labor that's been put into it. And so we might think that the extent of your property only goes so far as your labor. So maybe if you start to improve one little corner of that island, that would become your property. But it's not like you can appropriate the whole thing just by looking at it. You're not mixing much labor into something just by looking at it. There's also a question about how long-lasting labor is in terms of creating property rights. So, for instance, imagine Johnny Appleseed is walking across America, and through his labor drops, let's think of like a long-lasting tree, drops a pine cone for a redwood tree into the ground, and that grows into a sapling, and the sapling grows into a larger tree, and a larger tree, and a larger tree. Now, I guess we could ask the question, is it just the sapling that Johnny Appleseed owns? Or is it the 500, or this several hundred foot redwood sequoia, right? We might think that it would be a bit strange to think of like a small bit of labor giving you property in the entire thing, even though the labor is an essential part of the story of that tree. We might also ask the question of whether somebody could have property rights in something for several hundred years, right? So if a little bit of labor creates a tree that lasts for several hundred years, does property in that thing support itself just so long as the thing exists? That would be interesting, but this might also put us in a situation where we would run out of unowned goods in the commons. One last question that comes to mind for me. If the labor that you mixed is a part of you, so you own yourself, you own your labor, and by extension, that puts your property rights into the things that you've mixed your labor with. So again, you take an unvarnished bit of lumber, and you take a knife and you carve it into a spoon. Well, now you've mixed your labor and a bit of yourself into the spoon, right? And one thing that you apparently can do on the Lockean theory is then sell that spoon in exchange for money, right? Now, one thing that Locke told us is that you cannot sell yourself, right? You cannot sell yourself into slavery. But this raises an interesting question, right? Why is it that you can sell your goods and you can sell your labor, but you can't sell your person? It seems that the reason you own your labor and you own your goods is ultimately in that personal ownership. Why is it that we can alienate our right to property and a right to our own labor in a way that we cannot alienate our right to self-ownership? I'm genuinely curious about this question, and I think that sitting around with Locke's works and talking about it with others is probably the best way to work out a theory of what's going on with our ability to alienate our labor and to sell our property, which has a bit of ourselves in it. So that's it for this time. Our discussion of Locke's second treatise of government. Next time around, we're going to look at a theory of property that says something different. So, whereas Locke thinks that property is a natural right, Hume is going to deny this. So we're going to look at a competing theory of property from David Hume, from his book, A Treatise of Human Nature, The Origin of Justice and Property. So that's where we'll pick up next time. Thanks for coming along with me. I hope you learned something. And until then, take care and be well.